The marshes along the Bug River were black and still when the night exploded. A single column of fire rose against the low clouds, silent for a heartbeat. Then came the concussion, a flat, unearthly thud that rattled every pane in the nearby village of Sarnaki. By the time Captain Antoni Kotjan and his men of the Polish Home Army reached the site, the air reeked of burnt alcohol and scorched insulation. Their boots sank into the soaked peat as they followed the smoke to a crater that steamed like an open wound in the earth. It was 2 inches deep with viscous mud and filled with fragments of metal that did not belong to any weapon they had ever seen. Kotjan had been an engineer before the war, a glider designer who understood flight as instinct. What he saw now defied every principle he knew. A torn cylinder nearly 40 feet long lay half buried at an angle, its skin sheared and twisted, still radiating heat. There was no cockpit, no propeller, no intake. This machine had not been piloted, it had been hurled. Steam hissed from a ruptured tank. Somewhere deep inside, liquid oxygen met alcohol residue and crackled like dry ice on a stove. The men stepped carefully, their lanterns painting trembling circles of light across the wreckage. One of the soldiers bent and touched a section of the engine casing. He recoiled. "Still hot," he whispered. They could hear the slow tick of metal contracting as it cooled. In the scattered torchlight, they saw a complex heart of pipes and veins, a turbo pump machined with precision finer than any Polish workshop could achieve. Every surface carried numbers stamped into the alloy. German, unmistakably German. This was not an artillery shell. It was not an airplane. It was something new. Kotjan crouched beside the fractured tail. Here were 4 fins, cut at perfect angles, the control vanes of a thing that had flown faster than sound. He ran his fingers along the graphite steering surfaces, still faintly warm. Above him the clouds were thinning, and for a moment the moon caught the shape of the weapon in full, long, smooth, purposeful. It looked less like a bomb than a prophecy. He said quietly, almost to himself, "If they build these in number, London will bleed without warning." The men began their work. Each fragment was lifted, cleaned of mud, and wrapped in cloth. Every wire, every broken pipe section was catalogued on paper already damp with river mist. They worked in silence, except for the occasional grunt of effort and the low rumble of distant artillery from the Eastern Front. By dawn, 2 horse-drawn carts stood loaded with the dismembered body of Hitler's secret weapon. Operation Most 3, the code name for the transfer of captured German technology to the Allies, was underway. 2 nights later, a Dakota transport aircraft from the Royal Air Force descended onto a clandestine strip in occupied Poland. The packages were loaded aboard under firelight and flown west across the Carpathians. From there they went to London and finally to Farnborough, where British scientists waited in guarded curiosity. They expected fragments of a jet or perhaps an experimental artillery piece. What arrived on the hangar floor looked nothing like any known weapon. It was both primitive and miraculous, welded steel tanks, fragile aluminum guidance fins, plumbing that spoke of chemical genius. When the British engineers first assembled the major sections on a wooden trestle, the true scale became clear. The rocket for that is what it was stood taller than a house and broader than a locomotive boiler. The fuel system used alcohol and liquid oxygen fed by twin turbo pumps capable of 30,000 revolutions per minute. Its thrust chamber could generate 25 tons of force, enough to lift the machine 60 miles into the sky before it arced toward its target at nearly 3,500 feet per second. Nothing in existence could intercept it. No radar could track it in flight. Once launched, its arrival was instantaneous death. The scientists stared at the reconstructed engine and felt, for the first time in the war, genuine fear. Dr. John F. Thompson of the British Projectile Development Establishment recorded in his diary, "We have recovered the future. It is not reassuring." For years, the Allies had defined air power by mass squadrons, tonnage, formations of bombers filling the sky. This weapon rendered that arithmetic obsolete. It required no pilots, no escort, no air superiority. It needed only a launch table and fuel. Across London's ministries, analysts began calculating the implications. If Germany could produce even 200 rockets a day, a goal suggested by intercepted signals, the city would cease to function. No warning sirens, no shelters, no defense. Each missile carried a 1-ton warhead. Each impact could obliterate a block of houses in a silent instant. A memorandum from the Ministry of Home Security put it bluntly. At scale, this weapon renders continued habitation of London impossible. In the War Cabinet, the phrase vengeance weapon took on literal weight. Intelligence from Peenemünde, the Baltic testing ground, indicated that production was moving underground, beyond the reach of bombers. Photographs from reconnaissance flights showed launch pads camouflaged in forests, fuel convoys on hidden roads, and skeletal frameworks of what appeared to be mobile firing units. It dawned on the Allies that Hitler had achieved something unprecedented, a means of striking England without risking a single pilot. For years, the Allied advantage had been the sky. From the Battle of Britain onward, the Royal Air Force and, later, the United States Army Air Forces had measured victory in altitude. Whoever owned the air owned the war. The V-2 ignored that equation entirely. It traveled through space, not sky. It rose beyond interception, beyond the reach of fighters, beyond the logic of conventional warfare. It was a weapon that did not care who ruled the air, because it did not fly through it. In a secure conference at Whitehall, Air Marshal Sir Roderick Hill summarized the unease. "We have spent 5 years learning to fight in 3 dimensions," he said. "The Germans have just introduced a 4th. The recovered engine sat in a guarded hangar at Farnborough through the summer of 1944. Technicians cleaned it, diagrammed it, weighed each component. They discovered gyroscopes for guidance, servo mechanisms for automatic correction, and a combustion chamber lined with ceramic tiles capable of surviving temperatures above 2000 degrees Celsius. The engineering was at once elegant and monstrous. Every innovation spoke of minds unshackled by restraint and of a regime willing to spend any human cost to achieve technological transcendence. One evening, after another long day of analysis, a young British officer walked around the reconstructed rocket, tracing its curved skin with a gloved hand. "Imagine," he said softly to his colleague, "if they had finished this 1 year sooner." No one answered. They all understood. In that moment, as dawn light filtered through the hangar windows, the Allied engineers realized what the fragments from the Polish marshes truly represented. Not merely a new bomb, but a new era, one where cities could vanish without warning, where air superiority meant nothing, and where the future of warfare would be written not in wings and propellers, but in mathematics, guidance systems, and the roar of liquid oxygen. They had peered into the heart of Hitler's last gamble and seen how close he had come to changing the world. Farnborough, Hampshire, July, 1944. The weapon lay dissected under the white glare of hangar lamps, its organs spread across numbered tables. A sign above the cordoned-off area read, "Most secret, no unauthorized personnel." Inside, engineers in oil-stained overalls moved quietly among the pieces, recording measurements in ruled notebooks. What had arrived as wreckage from a Polish swamp had become an object of scientific reverence. The Allies were performing the first autopsy of a miracle. Major Duncan Sandys, Churchill's son-in-law and head of the Crossbow Committee, stood beside a section of oxidizer plumbing that gleamed like polished bone. "This," he murmured to a visiting American officer, "is the product of a nation strangled by blockade." He was right. Every valve, every weld, spoke of improvisation under siege. Yet the result defied comprehension. The Germans had built a functioning supersonic ballistic missile while their cities burned. Dr. Miles Cardew of the Projectile Development Establishment bent over the main engine, tracing the lines of the twin turbopumps. "They're running liquid oxygen at enormous pressures," he said. "Alcohol as fuel, graphite veins for steering. Simple, crude even, but it works." He tapped the bronze casing with his wrench. "Do you realize what this means? They've made spaceflight, in principle, practical." The phrase hung in the air like blasphemy. Spaceflight. It was July 1944, and Allied bombers were still fighting through flak over France. The idea that the enemy had already crossed into the frontier of outer space felt like a betrayal of nature itself. The analysis continued methodically. British chemists identified the fuel mixture: 75% ethyl alcohol, 25% water, chosen to prevent the combustion from melting the chamber walls. The oxidizer tanks were lined with insulation designed to hold liquid oxygen at -180 degrees Celsius. The guidance section contained 2 gyroscopes and an integrating accelerometer, primitive but functional. A small electric motor, powered by a silver oxide battery, adjusted 4 graphite paddles in the rocket's exhaust stream to maintain course. When the control section was opened, the technicians found the maker's plate: Siemens Rheinmetall, Werke, Berlin. It was a triumph of German engineering and a confession of German desperation. Every innovation was brilliant, but every material was chosen from scarcity. Where the Allies used aluminum alloys, the Germans used steel. Where precision machining required copper or nickel, they substituted ceramic or carbon. The miracle was that it worked at all. By the end of July, the full specifications had been charted. Length, 46 feet. Diameter, 5 feet 5 inches. Launch weight, nearly 14 tons. Burn time, 65 seconds. Maximum altitude, 50 miles. Impact speed, 3,300 miles per hour. Payload, 2,000 pounds of amatol. Circular error probable, 2.5 miles. To the mathematicians of the Ministry of Supply, those figures carried a terrible logic. A weapon launched from the Dutch coast could strike London in less than 5 minutes. There would be no sound of aircraft engines, no siren, no time for civilians to move. The explosion would come first, the noise would follow afterward, echoing across the city like an afterthought. Lieutenant Colonel F.R. Jeffreys of British intelligence summarized it in his report. This device renders the concept of defense irrelevant. Counter-battery fire is impossible. Interception, impossible. Warning, impossible. The only solution, he concluded, was to destroy production at the source, to strangle the miracle in its cradle. Even as the engineers worked, fragments of intelligence arrived from the continent. Aerial reconnaissance over the Baltic showed Peenemünde scarred by earlier bombing, yet activity continued underground. Photographs revealed rail lines leading into chalk hills near Nordhausen, new tunnels, vast ventilation stacks, and hundreds of slave labourers moving in lines. From captured German documents came the codename Mittelwerk. It was here, analysts realized, that the V2 or A4, as the Germans named it, was being assembled by the thousand. The autopsy took on a moral weight. Allied officers studying the guidance system could not escape the contrast between the perfection of the machine and the horror of the hands that built it. Each smooth joint, each calibrated bolt, had been fitted by a man dying in darkness. Intelligence briefings from escaped labourers described an underground city of suffering prisoners hanged beside the production line as warnings, corpses stacked between workbenches, men beaten for dropping a wrench. A weapon that could strike without mercy had been birthed without mercy. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, the scientist who had broken the German radio beam system years earlier, arrived to examine the guidance controls. He found them elegant, ingenious, and chilling. "It is almost alive," he said. "The rocket corrects itself continually, as though it wills to strike." He turned to Sandys. "You understand what they are doing. They have made bombardment automatic. They have removed the man from the trigger." For the first time, warfare had been mechanized beyond human touch. No pilot, no gunner, no conscience. Just mathematics, gravity, and chemistry performing murder at the speed of sound. At Whitehall, the Prime Minister demanded a full report. Churchill had heard rumours of flying bombs, but this was something else entirely. When Sandys presented the findings, Churchill sat silent, cigar unlit. "How many could they build?" he asked finally. Sandys answered, "If the intelligence is correct, perhaps 3,000 per month, once production stabilizes. Churchill's eyes narrowed. Then we must end the war before they do. In Washington, the captured data were shared with American scientists under the banner of joint intelligence. At Wright Field and Aberdeen, engineers pored over the blueprints. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department measured the turbopump tolerances with disbelief. Lockheed and Douglas representatives who examined the design concluded that reproducing such a system would require industrial precision at the very edge of existing capability. Yet the Germans had done it while losing the war. By late summer, the weapon had entered the realm of strategic terror. Analysts in the British Ministry of Home Security ran simulations. What would happen if the Germans launched 200 rockets per day at London? Within 3 weeks, half the city's population would have fled. Transport, power, and communication would collapse. Civilian morale already strained would break. The grim arithmetic circled back to one phrase repeated in every report. If they build these in number, the war becomes unwinnable. On the morning of August 1st, 1944, technicians at Farnborough completed reassembly of the first intact engine. It was mounted on a steel stand and connected to British-built control valves. When they ignited the mixture, a thunderous roar filled the airfield. The blast blew sandbags from their moorings and shattered windows in nearby cottages. The plume burned for less than a minute, but when it stopped, the men stood staring at the blackened test pit in silence. Dr. Cardew removed his ear defenders. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have just looked directly into the future." In that roar, the Allies finally understood the scale of what they faced and how close Hitler had come to wielding a weapon that ignored everything they believed about war, defense, and time itself. London, August 1944. The sound arrived before the news, a dull concussion that rolled through the capital like the beat of a giant's fist. Windows quivered, teacups rattled, and somewhere in the east a plume of dust lifted into the pale sky. Civilians looked upward, expecting aircraft, but there was only silence. No sirens, no warning. Just the echo of destruction. By the time the newspapers called it a mystery explosion, British intelligence already knew. The first operational V-2 rocket had struck London. At the Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall, officers gathered around a map crowded with pins. Each pin marked impact sites across southeastern England: Chiswick, Epping, Deptford, Maidstone. Beside them, typed sheets carried the latest estimates from the Scientific Intelligence Branch. Velocity, approximately 3,500 miles per hour, read one line. Altitude, over 50 miles. Another note was starker. Interception impossible. Only countermeasure, destruction of launch facilities before firing. The figures that followed chilled even seasoned staff officers. If Germany could sustain 300 rockets per day, a rate they were rapidly approaching civilian casualties would exceed 20,000 per month. The Ministry of Home Security calculated that 200 daily impacts could make London uninhabitable within 6 weeks. Communications would collapse, rail and power systems would fail, and evacuation of the government might become necessary. For the first time since 1940, a whisper moved through the War Cabinet. Could Britain survive this? Engineers translated the numbers into energy. Each V-2 carried a warhead weighing nearly 1 ton, half Amatol and half TNT. On impact, it released energy equivalent to 5 million foot-pounds of force. At 3,000 feet per second, it produced a crater 30 feet wide and 15 deep. Within 50 yards, no window survived. Within 100, no wall remained intact. But the true terror lay in its velocity. The explosion came first, the sound second. There was no defense, no warning, no chance to take cover. Across the Channel, Allied analysts studied captured documents from the Peenemünde raids. Production quotas projected 5,000 rockets per month once the underground Mittelwerk plant reached capacity. The math was simple. 5,000 rockets multiplied by 1 ton each equaled 5,000 tons of explosives, the equivalent of 1,000 heavy bombers delivered invisibly. The Luftwaffe was dying, yet Germany had found a way to strike without it. In a secure room at the Air Ministry, statistician Patrick Blackett pinned a new chart beside the bomber command losses. It showed 2 lines. The first represented Allied sorties per week, the second, projected V2 launches. If German output continued to climb, while Allied production strained under attrition, the lines would cross by spring of 1945. The meaning was inescapable. If the war did not end before then, the Allies could lose the home front through arithmetic alone. Across the Atlantic, similar conclusions appeared in American reports. The Army Air Force's Scientific Advisory Group estimated that a massed V2 bombardment could destroy London's docks, paralyze Antwerp, the lifeline for supplies to Europe, and render invasion ports useless. General Henry Hap Arnold scribbled in the margin of one report, "If they add gas warheads, the war changes overnight." What frightened strategists most was not what the Germans had done, but what they might yet do. The documents recovered from Peenemünde contained references to Anine and Aten, advanced rockets capable of crossing the Atlantic. Engineers calculated the trajectories and found them plausible. A longer airframe, a 2-stage booster, slightly refined guidance, and New York lay within reach. The notion that Manhattan could vanish without a warning siren turned theoretical fear into existential dread. Back in England, the scientists at Farnborough turned to their blackboards. They plotted trajectories, fuel curves, and impact patterns. Dr. Reginald Jones, ever the empiricist, approached it like an equation. If one V2 demanded 16 tons of alcohol and 8 tons of liquid oxygen, then 1,000 required 24,000 tons of propellant monthly. Allied bombers began targeting every oxygen plant in Western Germany. When the plants at Leuna and Bitterfeld were struck, German launch rates fell briefly. For a moment, arithmetic worked in Britain's favour. But the Germans adapted. They built mobile launchers, concrete pads hidden beneath camouflage nets, and fired at will. Each launcher could be ready within 6 hours, then vanish into the forest. By the time reconnaissance spotted one site, it was already cold. In the words of a Royal Air Force intelligence note, "We cannot bomb what no longer exists." Civil defense statistics painted their own grim portrait. By October of 1944, more than 1,200 civilians were dead from V2 strikes. Another 3,000 were injured. The rockets fell without pattern schools, markets, tenements, striking rich and poor alike, yet the population endured, as London always had. When the explosion at Stepney killed 50 and left a crater in the street, neighbours hung the Union Jack above the ruins before rescue crews arrived. Newspapers published photographs captioned simply, "They cannot frighten us." Behind the scenes, however, planners wrestled with unbearable projections. If Germany diverted even 10% of its remaining industrial capacity to rockets, the output could reach 6,000 per month. If chemical plants doubled liquid oxygen supply, production could reach 10,000. Each rocket required roughly 2,000 man-hours to construct. At Mittelwerk, that meant 40,000 slave labourers working 20 hours a day. The cost in human lives was staggering, 1 man dead for every rocket launched, but Hitler's regime no longer measured success in lives. The scientists called it the mathematics of extinction. It was not emotion, but calculation. A single device, multiplied by time, logistics, and fanaticism, could undo civilization. One equation from the Ministry of Economic Warfare summarized it perfectly. If production equals persistence, Europe dies. Among the Allied engineers, a new kind of dread settled in not fear of Germany's armies, but fear of its intellect. For years, the Allies had derided Nazi science as delusion, death rays, miracle tanks, impossible aircraft. Now they saw that behind the madness was method. The V2 was proof that even a collapsing regime could reach for the stars, and that the future might belong to whoever inherited its secrets. At midnight briefings in London and Washington, strategists began to speak in unfamiliar language. Words like ballistics, trajectory, payload, guidance, apogee. The vocabulary of astronomy had invaded the vocabulary of war. Every new calculation widened the same abyss. If the Germans had achieved this under siege, what could a victorious nation do with peace and resources? By the end of the year, the reports circulating between Allied command bore a quiet refrain, an acknowledgement that felt both triumphant and terrified. We have won the battle of industry, but the enemy has discovered the future. The mathematics of extinction were not confined to the Reich. Every analyst who held a slide rule over the V2's figures knew the truth. The technology could not be buried. It would live on, copied, improved, perfected. The weapon that promised the end of London had also revealed the beginning of a new world, one where the sky itself could no longer protect humanity. Peenemünde, Baltic coast, September 1944. The air smelled of salt, burnt fuel, and death. The Allied reconnaissance photographs had shown only rubble, but when British and American intelligence teams finally walked the site, they found something far stranger, the skeleton of a dream. Concrete bunkers gaped open like broken teeth. Rail lines ended abruptly in craters. The test stands where the first V2 rockets had leapt toward the heavens were twisted masses of steel, frozen mid-motion. Lieutenant Colonel T.R.B. Sanders of the Royal Engineers led the first inspection team. His boots, crunched over fused glass sand, turned to crystal by rocket exhaust. "This," he said quietly to the men around him, "is where the future began." They all understood. Peenemünde was more than a weapons range. It was the birthplace of an age. Inside the shattered assembly hall, the walls were blackened with soot. Charred wiring hung from the rafters like vines. But on one intact workbench lay a miracle of precision, a gyroscope assembly, perfectly balanced, the bearings polished to mirror brightness. Nearby, they found drafting tables covered in blueprints written in tight, technical German: Schwingungsdämpfer, Turbopumpe, Leitwerk. Every page radiated genius and madness in equal measure. One of the American scientists, Captain James P. Hamill from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, picked up a scorched file marked A4 Entwicklung. He flipped through it, translating aloud: trajectory correction, gravitational compensation, automatic pitch regulation. He looked up, face pale. "This isn't a weapon," he said. "It's a prototype for spaceflight." The team moved deeper into the ruins, their lanterns throwing long shadows. They found fragments of rocket nozzles made of a nickel-chromium alloy unknown to Allied metallurgy, and cooling channels machined with a precision that British factories could barely replicate even under ideal conditions. They discovered records of test firings that reached altitudes of 60 miles higher than any aircraft in history. A battered sign near one of the launch pits bore a single word: Hoffnung, hope. That word struck the British interpreter as obscene, for here, hope had been built on the bodies of slaves. The captured reports from the Mittelwerk tunnels had already reached London, describing the cost of production in blood. The engineers who walked Peenemunde's ruins could no longer separate awe from horror. Among the debris, a soldier pried open a rusted locker. Inside was a photograph: a young man in a white lab coat, standing beside a rocket frame, smiling. On the back, written in neat handwriting, was a name: Wernher von Braun. The name appeared again and again in the captured documents. Von Braun, technical director of the V2 program, only 32 years old. He had studied under the physicist Hermann Oberth, dreamed of sending man to the moon, and had instead built a machine that killed civilians by the thousands. To Allied analysts, he was a contradiction: visionary and war criminal, scientist and executioner. In a shattered observation bunker overlooking the launch pads, the intelligence team found notebooks filled with equations: fuel flow rates, combustion temperatures, aerodynamic coefficients, the mathematics of destruction. One margin note read simply: "One day, beyond the atmosphere." The realization came slowly, then all at once. Germany had not just built a rocket, it had built a blueprint for the next century. Every innovation found in the V2 turbopump design, inertial guidance, staged combustion, could as easily power a ship to the stars as a missile to London. The same knowledge that had murdered 10,000 civilians could, in another time, carry humanity beyond the sky. When the first detailed reports from Peenemünde reached Whitehall and Washington, reactions divided along a line of moral terror. Some saw it as proof of Nazi depravity, others as an opportunity too valuable to ignore. At the Pentagon, General Arnold read the summary and underlined one sentence: "The Peenemünde Group possesses knowledge indispensable to the future of aeronautics." The order went out quietly: capture the scientists alive. Even before Germany's surrender, Allied teams under Operation Paperclip began compiling lists. Von Braun, Dornberger, Riedel, names that would shape the post-war world. The race was no longer against Hitler, but against time and against the Soviets. The Red Army was already advancing toward the Baltic coast. Whoever reached Peenemünde first would inherit the future. In October, a second Allied mission arrived. They loaded crates with whatever remained intact instruments, drawings, even debris. Everything was tagged top secret. When one officer asked whether they were taking war trophies, Sanders replied, "No, we're taking civilization's next step if it doesn't kill us first." Meanwhile, in London, the V2 bombardment continued. Each week, more rockets fell, hundreds of them, their trails invisible against the clouds. Every impact was a reminder of what had begun on this quiet Baltic shore. Newspapers called them the vengeance weapons. But among the scientists who had seen Peenemünde, another name took hold: the ghosts of the future. For even as the Allies advanced, they understood that what they had uncovered could not be undone. The V2 had already crossed a boundary that no war could unmake. The laws of physics that carried its warhead over the Channel would, inevitably, carry something else across the stars. In December, when the last Allied engineers left Peenemünde, the Baltic wind had begun to turn cold. Snow lay thin over the wreckage. Before departing, Sanders paused at the edge of the launch field, staring at the burnt concrete pad where the first rocket had risen. He imagined the roar, the flame, the impossible ascent. Then he turned away. "Let it rot," one of his men said. "Nothing good was born here." Sanders looked back once more and shook his head. "You're wrong," he replied quietly. "Everything born here will outlive us all." He was right. In that abandoned corner of Germany, amid ruins and ash, the modern world had already begun to breathe. The V2 was dead, but its spirit, its science, its mathematics, its promise would soon rise again, under new flags, in new wars, and in the silent emptiness beyond the sky. May 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but the race for the future had already begun. Across the collapsing Reich, two armies moved not to conquer cities, but to capture minds. American armored columns pushed through Bavaria with lists in their pockets, names, coordinates, laboratories. Soviet detachments stormed through Thuringia and Saxony, their orders equally precise: seize the rocket engineers, the physicists, the mathematicians. Every shell that fell now was not for territory, but for knowledge. At Bleicherode, near the Harz Mountains, Wernher von Braun and his team of Peenemünde engineers gathered in a farmhouse under grey skies. The roar of distant artillery rolled over the hills. They had burned their documents, hidden critical blueprints in waterproof barrels, and buried them in a field. Around the table, men once devoted to Hitler now studied maps of Allied advances. Von Braun, his arm in a cast from a recent car accident, spoke calmly. "The question," he said, "is not whether Germany survives, it is who inherits our work." He had no illusions about the Reich's fate, but he understood that their creation, the rocket that had once fallen on London, was now currency more valuable than gold. The same machine that had embodied vengeance would, in the hands of its captors, decide the balance of power in the post-war world. On May 2nd, von Braun ordered his team to surrender to the Americans. In a convoy of trucks loaded with what remained of their research, they drove south through roads choked with refugees. White flags fluttered from antennae. At one crossroads near Reuter, they encountered an American patrol from the 44th Infantry Division. Major William Bromley accepted their surrender. His first words, recorded later in a debriefing report, were simple. "Gentlemen, you just won the planer. Next war for us." In the following weeks, American intelligence officers descended on the region like archaeologists. They dug up the buried barrels, retrieved thousands of documents, and began interviewing every scientist they could find. The program, given the deliberately bland title Operation Paperclip, aimed to secure as many German technical specialists as possible before the Soviets could reach them. By the end of summer, over 120 engineers, including von Braun, Dornberger, and Riedel, were on their way to the United States. Their destination was Fort Bliss, Texas, and later the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, a landscape not unlike the Baltic coast, empty and vast. There, under American supervision, the Peenemünde team rebuilt their creation piece by piece. In October 1946, the first captured V-2 launched from the desert floor, roaring into the blue sky. Soldiers who had fought through Europe watched in awe as the weapon that once terrorized London now served the victors. The reports from White Sands read like resurrection. Test successful. Maximum altitude reached 65 miles. Instrumentation intact. In the sterile language of data, the future of flight was being reborn from the ashes of defeat. Meanwhile, in the Soviet zone, another kind of recovery was underway. Red Army engineers, under the supervision of General Lev Gaidukov, scoured the wreckage of Nordhausen and Bleicherode. They found fragments of engines, incomplete rockets, and the remnants of production lines. Captured German specialists who had not fled with von Braun were taken east under heavy guard. Within months, a new research institute was established near Moscow, NII 88, and a replica of the V-2, designated Rhone, began taking shape. The Cold War had not yet been named, but its first weapons were already being assembled. The V-2 had ceased to be a Nazi project. It had become the foundation of the bipolar world. Back in London, British scientists watched with mixed emotions. At Farnborough, the remnants of the captured rocket still stood in the test hangar, its steel skin dulled by months of handling. Dr. Miles Cardew and his team received summaries from both the American and Soviet programs. They read with fascination and dread. "They will not stop at replicas," Cardew told his colleagues. "They will reach higher, faster. The next one will not carry a ton of explosives. It will carry a sun." He was not exaggerating. Even as they spoke, physicists in Los Alamos were refining equations that would yield the atomic bomb. The fusion of rocketry and nuclear energy would soon produce a weapon beyond comprehension, an intercontinental missile capable of delivering annihilation in minutes. The age of the V-2 was ending, but its legacy was mutating into something infinitely more lethal. The irony was almost unbearable. The weapon born in the darkness of the Mittelwerk tunnels built by slaves, tested on prisoners, used against civilians, had become the seed of human transcendence and terror alike. It would send the first artificial satellite into orbit, carry the first man into space, and hold the world hostage under the doctrine of mutual destruction. In the summer of 1945, as Europe buried its dead, a handful of engineers began sketching designs for a new generation of rockets longer, sleeker, guided by radio and radar. They spoke not of war, but of exploration. Yet, in every conversation lay the unspoken truth. The same trajectory that could reach the stars could also erase a city. At Peenemunde's ruins, overgrown now with grass and silence, British demolition teams planted charges to prevent any future use. The last remaining test stand collapsed in a thunder of dust. But even as it fell, its ghost had already escaped, carried in the minds of men to deserts, laboratories, and government offices across the world. When Wernher von Braun was asked years later whether he felt remorse for the thousands who had died beneath his invention, he paused a long time before answering. Our goal, he said, was to reach for the stars. We were given war instead. The interviewer pressed him. And did you succeed? Von Braun looked away, toward a model of a rocket that no longer bore the name V2. In the end, he said softly, we reached both. By the time the sun set on 1945, the battle for Europe was over. But in the laboratories of America and the Soviet Union, the war for the future had already begun, a war not of nations, but of equations, velocity, and gravity. The weapon that had fallen on London had become the blueprint for the heavens. The world would never again look at the sky without remembering where it began. A crater in the mud, a trail of fire, and the moment when mankind learned that even the stars could be instruments of war. Washington, D.C., 1946. In a sealed chamber beneath the Pentagon, a select audience of generals, scientists, and politicians gathered to watch a silent film. The projector rattled softly as grainy black and white footage flickered onto the wall, a desert, a steel tower, a long, slender shape poised on a launch pad. The film showed technicians retreating to bunkers, then a blinding column of fire erupting downward. The rocket rose, steady and majestic, leaving behind a boiling cloud of dust. It was one of the first American tests of a captured German V2. When the camera followed its ascent, the men watching could not help but feel awe and unease. The narrator's voice, recorded in a calm military tone, explained, maximum altitude, 60 miles. Velocity 3,500 miles per hour. Impact within 5 yards of predicted coordinates. The room was silent. Then General Henry Arnold turned to his aide and said, gentlemen, this is no longer a weapon. It's the beginning of a new kind of war. Across the ocean, the Soviets reached the same conclusion. By 1947, under the direction of Sergei Korolev, Soviet engineers had perfected their own copy of the V2 the Rhone. Though it was little more than a replica, the lessons learned from it became the stepping stones toward larger dreams. The ruins of Peenemünde had been replaced by the frozen plains of Kazakhstan, where the future launch site of Baikonur would one day rise. Both sides now possessed the same ghost, a weapon that could leap beyond the reach of any defense. But what haunted strategists more was its potential marriage to the new physics of destruction, atomic power. The scientists who had built the Manhattan Project now worked in parallel with the engineers who had studied von Braun's diagrams. The fusion of these two legacies, nuclear fire and ballistic flight, promised an apocalypse conducted at the speed of sound. In the years immediately following the war, the public knew almost nothing. Newspapers wrote of captured German scientists aiding American aeronautics, but the real scope of Operation Paperclip remained buried in classified archives. In Texas and New Mexico, fences rose around secret compounds where men who had once worn Nazi uniforms now worked under American flags. Officially, they were technical consultants. Unofficially, they were architects of the next century. Wernher von Braun, now clean-shaven and wearing a U.S. Army uniform, wrote technical memoranda on propulsion and guidance systems. He lectured at Fort Bliss, explaining turbopumps and flight control theory to young American engineers who had fought in Europe only months before. His voice was calm, scholarly, without a trace of accent when he spoke of fuel mixtures and thrust-to-weight ratios. Yet in private, he admitted to an aide, "It is strange to serve the nation that bombed us, but history belongs to those who understand physics." At Los Alamos, scientists, like Robert Oppenheimer and Norris Bradbury, studied the same equations from a different angle. The atomic bomb had proven the power of splitting matter. The rocket promised to deliver it anywhere on Earth. When these two technologies met, geography itself would become meaningless. "The world," Bradbury wrote in a confidential note to the Joint Chiefs, "has shrunk to a single equation. Energy multiplied by velocity equals extinction." In London, the British intelligence officers who had once sifted through V2 wreckage read the first reports of American and Soviet missile progress with growing unease. Dr. Reginald Jones wrote in a confidential memorandum, "We have defeated the Reich but adopted its machinery. The line between civilization and annihilation now depends upon who calculates faster. The irony was absolute. The weapon that had once been a symbol of tyranny had become the foundation of deterrence. The V-2's descendants would one day stand silent in underground silos, their warheads measured not in tons of TNT but in megatons of sunlight. The same technology that had once been born in the darkness of Mittelwerk would become the shield and sword of the free world. By 1948, the U.S. Army had begun formal studies on long-range ballistic missiles. The Hermes and Bumper programs, built directly from V-2 heritage, sought to extend range, improve guidance, and eventually carry atomic payloads. In secret, von Braun's team at White Sands conducted experiments on multi-stage rockets. Their test articles bore code names Hermes Aone, Atu, but the spirit was unmistakable. Peenemünde lived again, beneath the American sun. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev's engineers struggled with shortages, sabotage, and political fear. Stalin's scientists worked under constant suspicion, but the dream of catching the Americans drove them relentlessly. The Germans gave us the tools, Korolev told his subordinates, but the future will belong to those who build their own. In December 1948, a Soviet R-2, a stretched and improved version of the V-2, reached 70 miles altitude. In the same month, at White Sands, an American Bumper rocket, using a V-2 first stage and a WAC Corporal upper stage, broke the 100-mile mark. The line that defined space had been crossed, quietly and without ceremony, by the ghosts of Hitler's engineers. Scientists who had once feared the V-2 now began to dream beyond it. Some saw its potential for peace, satellites for weather, communication, and exploration. Others saw only its military logic, the ability to strike unseen and unstoppable. The world had entered an age where every discovery carried two shadows, one of promise, one of annihilation. At the National Archives, the declassified British reports from 1944 gathered dust, but one note in the margin of the final summary still seemed prophetic. If perfected, this weapon may end the next war before it begins, or end mankind with it. In the autumn of 1949, when the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, the meaning of those words became clear. The arms race had begun not in a laboratory, but in a crater on the outskirts of London. The ghost of the V-2 had not died. It had simply evolved. At the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum decades later, a V-2 would stand restored, its steel body immaculate under soft lights. Tourists would stare upward, children pointing, parents reading plaques that spoke of the first human-made object to reach the edge of space. Few would notice the quiet line etched on the display's lower panel, a quote from an Allied intelligence officer in 1924. 45. It was born of war, but it belonged to the future. God help the future. For all its horror, the V-2 had done something unprecedented. It had forced humanity to confront the infinite and to see that the sky was not salvation, but the next battlefield. The engineers who once worked in the cold mud of Peenemünde had unleashed more than a rocket. They had rewritten destiny, and when the world looked up in wonder at the age of space, it would do so under the long, unbroken shadow of a weapon first built to kill without warning. Cape Canaveral, Florida, July, 1953. The Atlantic lay calm beneath the humid dawn. On a narrow strip of sand and scrub, a long white rocket stood poised against the horizon. Technicians in khaki shirts moved silently around it, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The weapon had no swastika now, no iron cross, only a fresh insignia, the blue star and bar of the United States Air Force. But beneath the paint, the lineage was unmistakable. The fuel lines, the turbopump assemblies, the curved fins at its base, all spoke of Peenemünde. In the control bunker, Wernher von Braun stood beside Colonel Holger Toftoy, the American officer who had first championed his arrival to the United States. Von Braun's face was expressionless as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The ground trembled. A pillar of orange flame erupted beneath the missile, followed by the unmistakable roar of liquid oxygen meeting alcohol. The rocket climbed, shaking the earth, trailing a comet tail that split the Florida sky. At 2 miles altitude, it tipped eastward and accelerated. Engineers watched their instruments: altitude, velocity, fuel pressure, guidance signal. At 50 miles, the roar faded. The rocket arced gracefully out of sight, following a curve calculated months before on Peenemunde's same equations. 90 seconds later, it vanished beyond radar range. Impact confirmed 170 miles downrange, a voice announced. Applause filled the room, restrained but triumphant. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Toftoy turned to von Braun. "Congratulations, Doctor. We're officially in space." Von Braun smiled faintly. "Not space, Colonel," he said quietly. "Only the edge of it. But we're getting closer." The Americans called the missile Redstone. To the men who had built its ancestor, it was the A4 reborn, the same principles refined and tamed. Its engine was stronger, its guidance more precise, its body forged not for vengeance, but for understanding. Yet beneath every success lingered the same paradox that had haunted Peenemunde. Knowledge born of atrocity, now turned toward wonder. That summer, while the world celebrated peace, scientists across both hemispheres prepared for a different kind of competition. The Soviets had tested their first thermonuclear device. The United States had already begun work on intercontinental missiles. Both sides had inherited the same German technology, and both had drawn the same conclusion. The next war would be decided not by armies, but by trajectories. In Moscow, Sergei Korolev's R-5 rocket thundered into the clouds above Kapustin Yar. It was a slender machine longer than the V-2, twice as powerful. When it struck its target hundreds of miles away, Soviet engineers applauded as their leader raised his hand. "We have surpassed the Germans," Korolev said simply. But he was wrong. The Germans had merely changed uniforms. By 1957, the race that began with a crater in London reached orbit. On October 4th, a tiny sphere called Sputnik crossed the night sky, broadcasting a steady, beeping heartbeat. The world looked upward in awe and fear. The first object to circle the Earth had been launched by a descendant of the V-2, the R-7 rocket, born of Peenemunde's design and Soviet ambition. In Washington, von Braun and his team watched the news in silence. The irony was unbearable. They had come from a defeated nation to a victorious one, only to see their own creation triumph under a red star. Reporters demanded answers. How had the Americans, with all their resources, been beaten into space by the Soviets? Von Braun's response was simple. "We were ready. We simply were not allowed." But the shock of Sputnik changed everything. Within months, Congress approved unprecedented funding for missile and space research. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was born. NASA and von Braun, the man once branded a servant of Hitler, became its chief architect for the new frontier. His Redstone rocket, modified for science instead of war, launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, in January 1958. The transformation was complete. The weapon that had once murdered civilians without warning was now the chariot of human progress. The same equations that had sent fire into London now carried instruments into the heavens. Yet even as school children watched the launches with joy, those who knew the weapon's origin felt a chill. The line between salvation and destruction had grown impossibly thin. Inside the Pentagon, another branch of the legacy continued. While NASA reached for the stars, the Air Force refined the missiles that could end civilization. Atlas, Titan, Minuteman, each owed its existence to the A4's simple truth. Gravity could be defeated and distance erased. The same hands that built machines for discovery also built them for deterrence. In 1961, when a Soviet cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth, von Braun reportedly watched the broadcast alone in his office. "They have fulfilled our dream," he told an assistant. "I only wish it had begun differently." 2 months later, standing beside President John F. Kennedy. He presented the roadmap that would carry America to the moon. Every drawing, every equation, every trajectory, all traced back to the same place, the wind-swept concrete pads of Peenemünde. As Apollo's rockets thundered into space, the engineers who had once built weapons of vengeance now spoke of exploration, peace, and destiny. Yet even in triumph, they could not escape the shadows that followed them. The same Saturn V that lifted mankind to the moon could, with a different payload, have erased cities. The power was the same. Only intention had changed. At the National World War II Museum decades later, an aging American pilot stood before a restored V2. "I saw one of these come down on London," he told a group of students. "No sound, no warning, just fire and dust. But that's the thing about power. You can't uninvent it. You can only decide what it's for." The guide nodded, quoting a line etched beneath the exhibit. "The first object to touch the edge of space was built by slaves, designed by dreamers, and carried by the hands of killers. Humanity never stopped climbing. The V2 had begun as an instrument of terror. It ended as the foundation of spaceflight. Between those 2 points stretched a century of brilliance and blood. Every satellite, every astronaut, every launch that lit the night sky was a whisper from 1944 from the engineers who looked at the stars and saw, not heaven, but trajectory. The weapon that once fell upon London had finally reached the moon. But the shadow it cast still stretched across the earth, a reminder that in mankind's pursuit of the infinite, the ghosts of Peenemünde would always be waiting at the edge of the light. Washington, D.C., 1985. The auditorium of the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum was filled with men whose lives had once circled each other through war, secrecy, and the long shadow of technology. Some wore medals from armies that had opposed one another. Others wore name badges from NASA, the U.S. Air Force, or the European Space Agency. All had gathered for a single purpose: to mark the 40th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and to honor the scientists and engineers who had carried humanity beyond the atmosphere. At the center of the stage stood Wernher von Braun's greatest legacy, a section of the Saturn V rocket, gleaming white under spotlights. Its immense bulk seemed to fill the hall, a silent monument to human ambition. Above it, suspended from the ceiling, hung a smaller relic, the nose cone of a V2, its metal scarred and darkened by time. The contrast was deliberate, the beginning and the culmination of a single story, written in fire. As the ceremony began, the announcer read from a prepared statement. 40 years ago, the world discovered that the sky itself could become a battlefield. From that darkness came the knowledge that has carried mankind to the stars. The words hung in the air, part triumph, part warning. In the front row sat veterans of the London Blitz, men and women who had watched the first rockets fall in silence, their terror recorded in diaries and letters. Next to them sat astronauts who had ridden the descendants of those same machines into orbit. Between them stretched an entire century's worth of transformation from destruction to discovery. When the speeches ended, the audience rose as a grey-haired engineer approached the lectern. He had been one of the young British scientists who examined the wreckage of the first V2 that fell on Chiswick in 1944. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I remember the crater. I remember thinking that nothing human could have built such a thing, and yet it was human, built by men who loved music, mathematics, perhaps even beauty. We were terrified then, but now I see that terror was only the first step toward understanding. The weapon that shattered London also opened the heavens. That is the paradox we live with, that progress and peril are born together." The room was silent. For a moment, even the cameras stopped clicking. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, a child stood staring up at the blackened V2 nose cone. His father, a former Air Force pilot, rested a hand on his shoulder. "That one was meant to kill," he said softly. "The white one beside it, that one took us to the moon. Same science, different purpose. Remember that." The boy nodded, eyes wide. Above them, the relics of war and peace hung side by side, their shadows crossing on the museum floor. Outside, the night sky was clear, and high above the city a satellite traced a silent arc, its orbit the mathematical echo of a weapon once meant for vengeance. It was impossible to tell whether the light represented salvation or warning, perhaps both. Humanity had inherited not just the dream of flight, but the responsibility of power. From the mud of Peenemünde to the surface of the moon, one truth endured: knowledge could not be conquered, only guided. The V2 had proven that the line between creation and destruction was as thin as the atmosphere itself, and that once crossed, it could never be redrawn. The sky belonged to everyone now, but its shadow still spoke in the same language, the thunder of engines, the trembling of the earth, and the eternal reminder that every ascent begins with fire.